All right, everyone. So our next and last speaker actually is Matthew Gravel. Matthew is the president CEO at FNMA and director in North America at Valutico. He's a strategy M&A and innovation expert with a background in market intelligence, consulting, and international trade. Matthew led the development of a new business unit from 0 to 300 employees in its first 3 years through a mix of acquisition, open innovation, and organic initiatives by leading strategy, deals, integration, and CEO board level reporting. Forward thinking, Matthews focused on creating value through open innovation and financial returns through investment in early stage C3B startups, in autonomous systems, and advanced manufacturing. Outside of the office, Matthew is a huge soccer fan and photographer lover. He gets it all done with a French American perspective. Also, Matthew is actually on the first day of the program when he was scheduled to talk to us. He became a father. So, congratulations, Matthew. And without further delay, Matthew, off to you.
All right, thank you very much. I'll start sharing my screen, and that should help us. So thanks everyone. I understand it's been a pretty long program, and apologize for coming in last. I was supposed to be earlier, but as last mentioned, life happened. Um, I think you'll see that compared to some of the rest of your program, I tend to be a little bit more high level. I'm not going to go into the specifics of any given solution, but that said, I always make myself available. I have limited, very limited, in fact, expertise in matters of supply chain. I know it's a topic of high importance to you guys. My career has been mostly around services, but nevertheless, wherever my knowledge can be helpful, I would be more than happy to make myself available. And you'll find my contact information at the end of this presentation. To follow along, you can actually use this QR code. And so if you're at home and you want to scan this with your phone, otherwise we'll share the URL, but this entire presentation is built as a website. And that way you would be able to access all of the content. In some cases, there are things we're going to glance over and you may be able to click on the link to see a little bit more detail. And that way this proves to be hopefully a good resource for you, as well as to get in contact with me as needed. As Blas mentioned, my career has been mostly around innovation, really, for about 15 years, both on the consulting side, then corporate, where I built a business unit that was the first digital business unit for a traditional business, as well as a corporate venture fund, invested in about 10 companies as a venture capitalist, and about 75 companies personally as an angel investor. So this is sort of my focus. I teach innovation for two universities now, University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, as well as IE Business School in Spain. It's a topic I'm really passionate about, and I'm excited to share that with you guys. So what we'll talk about is a couple things that hopefully you already have a lot of the answers to, and what I'm hoping to do is bring a little bit of a different perspective. I hope you'll find that my take on things is a little bit different than what you typically hear from folks, and I'm very happy to take questions, interruptions, challenges really at any point in time. The idea is this is meant to be interactive, and it's meant to be something that helps you think a little bit differently. And so by all means, don't let me just have my way and and tell you my version of the world. Please come at me with challenges, feedback, questions, etc., etc. So step one, we'll talk about why bother at all with digital transformation. I mean, I think that's a question that everyone inherently knows you have to do it, but we'll go a little bit more at the root of why is that. Then we'll qualify a little bit what we mean by digital transformation. We'll try to explain the different flavors of it if you wish. When are you doing it as a growth opportunity? When are you doing it as a necessary to survival sort of stake? And when are you doing it just for the sake of doing it? And is that wrong or not? Eventually, we'll cover really the meat of the program, which I think a lot of the talks that you've had the past few days were really centered around that. It's how do you actually do it? And so in the how, I want to cover sort of like the high level strategy, but then a little bit more practical execution wise, and then give you some resources as well to actually take that learning outside of the classroom and keep going essentially once you go back to your normal day job. And we'll save some time for Q&A. And obviously, as I mentioned, you'll have my contact information to follow up if you need to. So step one, why? Why do we bother with digital transformation? Well, there's three main reasons. Number one, it's everywhere. You really can avoid it. I mean, I think your industry is very traditional, right? It's a liquid that's been a beverage that's been made for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, even, and yet Digital transformation is impacting you guys. It's impacting product industries. It's impacting service industries. It's impacting even NGOs and charities. Currently listening to a great book called Intrapreneurs by Gib Bullocks, I think. And so talking about how create a charity organization within Accenture and the impact of digital transformation on that. So that's one of the aspects. There's no industry, no country that is not impacted. And then the second aspect is there is no one that isn't impacted. Everyone's job, whether you are in accounting, whether you're in supply chain, like I think a lot of you are, marketing, whatever. Like really, there is not a single function in an organization that is not affected in one way or another by digital transformation. So that's why we'll cover some of that. And then eventually, it's confusing. So why study digital transformation? Why attend programs like this? It's to make sense of it all, to essentially call the noise and extract the signal out of it, understand really what is worth following, what is not worth following, and sort of take it from there. So, number one, we mentioned the aspect of it being everywhere. There's an essay that was published just shy of 10 years ago by Mark Anderson. Mark Anderson was involved in some of the most famous early stage startups in the mid to late 90s, companies like Netscapes and others, for those of you who even remember, and is now a venture capitalist, arguably one of the most famous venture capitalists in the world from the firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. And so, what he wrote at the time, 2011, is that software is eating the world and that every single industry is being disrupted by software. And those that have not yet been disrupted, it's coming eventually. And so, today, this seems like a very obvious statement. It's sort of like, duh. In 2011, it was actually, it doesn't feel like that long ago, but 2011 is some ways ago. And actually, there was a lot of skepticism. Silicon Valley wasn't as prevalent in the common mind share of everyone. Transformation, digitizing everything wasn't already widely accepted to be the way forward. And so I find this essay interesting. I would recommend the link is in there. Take a look at it and keep in mind this is almost 10 years old, and I think it feels very prescient when you read it. So, a caveat to that, when I say we didn't really realize digital transformation before, it's actually partly true. One side of us, the personal side, the side that goes home after this last talk of your stay, that side gets it. That side of you had a flat screen TV 10 years ago, had a smartphone 10 years ago. Already maybe some of you have your own website, blogs, whatever. Maybe you have a robotic vacuum cleaner. Like I think as consumers, we've adopted and embraced that quite rapidly. And typically, when we see innovation as consumer, it looks something like this. You see the diffusion of it, and you know that a new technology is coming up, and only a small fraction of people will essentially adopt it at first. That will be what we call the innovators. That may be, one of you, or it might be, one of your cousins, your nephews, whatever. That is really the first one to jump on some kind of technology, and then eventually you see a few more people adopting it. And then eventually you see the mainstream. This is a normal distribution curve. I think most of you are engineers or engineer-like folks, so I don't need to explain what a distribution curve is, hopefully. And so this is sort of how it moves over time, right? Over time, you start getting a larger proportion of people that are familiar with the technology, maybe even adopters of the technology. Now, as executives, as people that are tasked with driving innovation, you need to rethink that curve a little bit and actually realize what does it take to actually make my product go through this cycle. And so really it separates into two aspects. Number one is ideation. And ideation is a somewhat looser definition where maybe even the prototype or the first sort of versions and all of that can count as ideation. But that's only as good as getting you to the innovators. The innovators and maybe the early adopters, they'll be willing to put up with a product that is half broken. They'll be willing to deal with something that's not perfect just because they want in on the new stuff. But if you really want to reach that mainstream, if you want to get over that hump, if you want to get the 80% of the population to potentially consider what you're doing, or in a case like you, if you really want something that will work for all of your suppliers, all of your partners, and not just the ones that are super tech savvy, where the big difference is execution. You have to execute the crap out of your innovation strategy and do that relentlessly. And that's going to be even more important than the ideation aspect itself. So how it typically works and why that sort of curve works the way it does. And it always sort of works that way. It's always worked that way in the past, and it presumably will keep working that way. It's a market dynamic, right? You have a new technology that reaches um, a critical point of awareness. And I know some of you have mentioned blockchain in some of the questionnaires that you filled out, and it goes everywhere. People start cramming that technology in everything they can think of. And eventually, as any good market does, the market sort of validates what does make sense, what doesn't make sense, etc. And so that's sort of how innovations end up spreading. The flavors of innovation, the flavors of blockchain that don't make sense, they will just remain at the early adopter stage, but they will never cross into the chasm because the execution is not worth it. And the ones that work will actually end up going into reaching sort of a more mainstream application, not just level of awareness. Another example I like to use, because I've invested in a couple of VR companies, either personally or as a venture capitalist. Same case where we don't really know yet what exactly will make sense. Some use cases of VR will be phenomenal. Maybe VR for travel, especially in times like this with COVID. Maybe VR for training some of your machine operators and showing them without having to stop the line, without having to bring new people on the floor, showing them how to repair a machine or things like that. Maybe that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't. I've seen some examples that it's pretty easy to say that probably doesn't make sense. I don't know if you have any finance people in the room, but somebody has developed a solution to do via Excel graphs. And so essentially you can dive inside the 3D graphs, and I don't know how much value this really creates. And so the idea is just you have to understand the technology first and then have some degree of skepticism, and I would actually argue cynicism, to figure out what is it that's going to make sense and what is it that is actually just a waste of time and nonsensical. There are three things. I'll show a couple examples, but really I want to move on to sort of three graphs that are key. Examples of technologies that were maybe overdone. Again, blockchain, maybe cryptocurrency was an application, and then trying to cram it into everything, even in the physical wallet, which I find kind of ironic. The electric carving knife, one of my favorite examples. This was in the, I think, 70s and 80s when the brushless DC motors became very cheap, very easy to make. And that was the same thing, right? Right now we think digital transformation, this is so new. Actually, it's just always the same. Every time there's a new technology, people overdo it. And so in the 70s and 80s, literally every kitchen appliance you could think of had a motor in it. At least there was a version of it. And so we had electric carving knives, electric can openers. You probably had, all the gadgets were electrified essentially just for the sake of it. And eventually now we know, most of them don't make sense. And I don't think I've seen an electric carving knife for a long time. So the three things you need really, my goal is not to give you a fish specific to AB InBev. It's more like to teach you how to fish. And there are three sort of graphs that I think explain most of the world, really, especially the innovation world. The first one is this. It's called the Gartner Hype Cycle. Anyone familiar with it? Anyone wants to tell me what this is, or do you just want me to cover this? You can unmute yourself if you want to enlighten everyone. Going once, going twice, going thrice. All right. Gartner Hype Cycle is a simple framework to explain how a technology navigates the mindset of people in any given industry. And the word any given industry is extremely important because the Gartner Hype Cycle in the beverage industry, especially alcoholic beverage industry, might be entirely different from the Gartner Hype Cycle in another industry. And so that's what you have to keep in mind. But bottom line is the way it works, there's an innovation trigger at the beginning. People realize, holy crap, this technology could make sense for us. And then as we are prone to do as humans, we get overly excited and we start thinking, oh my God, we should do blockchain for everything. I'll keep using blockchain since I know you guys have used that as an example. We'll start doing blockchain for everything. We'll have employee badges that will be registered on the blockchain, but also every case of beer that will move will be on the blockchain. Also the trucks will be on the blockchain. Everything will be there. And so it goes through that peak of inflated expectation. And by putting everything on the blockchain, we'll save so much money for some reason, etc., etc. What typically happened at that point, it's not always the case. I want to say, there are some technologies like smartphones or whatever that just go linearly. But what happens most of the cases with other technologies is this. You reach a certain peak and there's a degree of fatigue and a degree of cynicism. There's a couple things that have been tried that don't work. Maybe blockchain for employee badges, you realize that was a waste of time, waste of money, doesn't procure any benefits, etc. And so you have the opposite. People start being overly negative, and then you go through what's called a trough of disillusionment. People start saying, blockchain was a waste of time. I can't believe we did this. We should stop doing blockchain for every single thing. And over time, eventually the market, even market in that loose term, it could be just a market of mindset within your enterprise or whatever, reaches a consensus of, actually, for those 2 or 3 applications, they did make sense. And over time, you figure out what is the plateau of productivity for any given technology.
Yeah, Jose was given a good example of it's kind of the same that happened in dot-com bubble in early 2000s.
Yeah, exactly. Great example. And in that case, it was a very basic technology, right? It was just like putting every business online, and some businesses, we're not ready. I would argue that nowadays, yeah, every business can be online, but back then it wasn't necessarily the case. And so some people sunk a ton of money. A great example, huge fan of massive failures if you get to know me. And one of my favorite example is Webvan. Grocery deliveries right now, obviously a huge hit. Instacart, Amazon Prime Fresh, many other services, Postmates and all of that. But in 1999, I think, Webvan raised $800 million to do this. And so it wasn't fundamentally a wrong idea, but it just nothing else. Like consumers weren't ready to order groceries online. The supply chain wasn't ready. Nothing was ready. And so it definitely, they were too early and didn't follow sort of like the understanding of that curve. Second framework to be familiar with is just a product life cycle. I usually explain this to people that are in the service industry. I think people in new industry understand it a lot better, FMCG and all of that stuff. Although your products probably don't go through quite that same trajectory, but that's simply how most products sort of go through their lives, right? You introduce the product, the new features, etc., then it grows and it reaches maturity, and eventually you retire maybe a brand or a product line or something. The iPod is a good example. I know Vlast, you like to use the iPod for a variety of example. I think it fits there really well. Eventually reached maturity. Sales were pretty flat, really great, but flat. And eventually Apple worked to retire it and essentially replace it by a new line of product, in that case, the iPhone. And then final thing to understand, especially given, the focus here on Silicon Valley and all of that, is just how a lot of businesses work. And that's not you. You guys are sitting on piles of cash, so you're fine. But a lot of companies, when they're thinking through innovation, this is what they have to deal with. They have to realize that on the y-axis here is my P&L. Am I making money? Am I losing money? When you start a business, the cost of product development, the cost even of launching and commercializing before I have enough sales, that's called the valley of death. And that's why a lot of startups are raising a ton of money. And so you have to sort of understand that is that when you look at your competition, you look at services that do, I don't know, beverages delivery or just companies that are starting up, etc. Sometimes it's easy to dismiss them and say, well, they're not making any money. Part of it is by design, is just knowing that if we can raise the capital to do a lot of aggressive things in that area and you can overcome the valley of death, then eventually, if you do things right, you can do it in such a way that the curve is very steep. And once you reach break even, then it's extremely steep and extremely profitable. Amazon is a great example of that. They realized that through Jeff Bezos and just the credibility that they were building, they could afford to lose money for 15 years because they knew that the engine they were building underneath all that was actually one with a very steep profit potential down the line. Any questions on that? All right, moving on. So second aspect of why we should care, because it's everyone's job. I'll speed up a little bit because I want to get to the what and the how a little bit faster. But really, open innovation as an overall concept that I don't know if you're familiar with has made it so that everyone has to be involved in innovation. Traditional innovation is essentially what you would see if I slide this to the right. You do 100 research projects, and then 10 of them survive at the end. That's it. And others are abandoned because your R&D didn't deliver, the market shifted. But essentially, this was how R&D was done back in the days. You start things internally, it's a closed funnel, and only a percentage of them survive at the end. open innovation as a model has changed that drastically in the past 15 years or so. And what it does is it makes two things. One, it makes the funnel actually open, where things can come in and get out at any point in time. And so you can actually say, I don't need to start this R&D process. I can actually let academia or let startups do it and eventually acquire that or license the technology and reinsert that into my funnel right here towards the middle. Or what I can do is I can also widen my funnel and have a bunch of ideas, knowing that some of them will not make sense for me, but I can push them out of my funnel into somebody else's portfolio. I can sell the IP, I can maybe license it, I can partner, I can essentially divest a half-baked idea. And so how does that translate? If we take a very simple product, the toaster, I like to use a toaster as an example. I worked for UL for a little bit over 10 years, and it's a safety company. Always use a toaster as an example to show, this is what we do. We make sure a toaster doesn't kill you when you toast your bread. And so if you think about the toaster, and this is obviously a hypothetical scenario, right? Very simple product. The original version that we'll call the humble toaster does two things. It toasts the bread, and because we're very fancy, it actually even can adjust it. You can say, I want it pretty much chilled, or I want it just slightly warmed up. Then with innovation, we got the Toastomatic 2000, a phenomenal model in stores now. And so what it does is those two things, but it added a few other aspects, a programmable timer and maybe Bluetooth enabled. That way you're in bed and you can just trigger the start of the toasting experience. And so this is also where you don't have to necessarily just buy it in stores. You can maybe buy online and order a custom shell with your initials on it or something, so it looks really nice on your kitchen counter. But then if you think about open innovation and where the world is going, let's imagine Toaster.io v3, release date 2025. It does all those things, but also it's voice enabled. So you can actually just tell it, you smell burnt on the other end of the kitchen, you can just say stop toasting. Maybe it has antibacterial nano coating. That way, all the crumbs that keep falling inside of it, no funky mold is going to develop, etc. And also, by the way, there's a big innovation here. It's a model that you subscribe to. You subscribe to the toaster. You pay $1 a month for the use of the toaster, and you get software updates, etc., etc. So why are we using this kind of like stupid example? Because if you think about being the company that makes this toaster, and how it used to be run, probably just a simple company, simple supply chain, simple org chart, etc. And innovation was really the R&D team trying to find, a better heating element or what have you, really, to improve, toasting faster and whatever. Today or tomorrow with the Toaster.io v3, you need engineers in nanomaterials, you need engineers in Bluetooth, voice activation, natural language processing, all those things. And so that's why you have to do open innovation. You cannot, as a simple toaster company, start building all those things. You cannot attract the talent. What kind of natural language processing engineer will want to go work for a toaster company? Not the good kind. So what you're better off doing is building on the shoulders of giants, licensing your technology from partners, whether it's IBM that I know was talking right before me or somebody else. Bottom line is you have to embrace open innovation. You cannot keep your innovation funnel purely in-house. Another way to show this is this little diagram here. It's very hard to read. I think you can find it easily. It's the overlay is mine, but the background is actually a graph from McKinsey, and it shows essentially all the different functions that a company does in the realm of digitization, from customer experience to the distribution channels, et cetera, et cetera. And the point of my overlay here is just to show you that no one person oversees the entire thing, and that's why innovation needs to be everyone's job, not only in silos, but it needs to be in everyone's job and a team sport. You cannot innovate. Let's use our supply chain again without involving the CMO, the chief marketing officer, and the marketing team. This is not just something for the chief operating officer and the CFO. This is something that has wider repercussion. And so it's very important to have innovation being interwoven across the organization. The problem is that most organizations are still doing this. They decide, we're going to innovate. And so they give somebody a title of chief innovation officer or chief digital officer or something like this. Usually sounds really nice. Maybe it's a reward to somebody who's been very loyal, very good at whatever for many years. but it doesn't necessarily have what it takes to succeed. First of all, in this particular example, cartoonish example, it's isolated. This is a separate org chart from the rest of the business. And second of all, it's full of non-execution driven things. Those are all like a bunch of idea people and all of that stuff. And so the goal of this cartoon is to highlight how essentially not to do it. In reality, the way to do it, and there's significant research that shows this from academia and the professional world, is to have a decentralized model. Now, I realize it's not always practical, especially at first, if you're just trying to trigger innovation within an organization. But at maturity, the best innovation teams are fully decentralized. They have innovation ambassadors, if you wish, that are embedded within the P&Ls that report directly to the P&L owners, etc., and have a dotted line to the whoever governs the innovation. It's also typically based on merit and culture. It's title agnostic. It doesn't have to be and shouldn't be, in fact, something that's based on seniority or anything. Innovation is almost like it's not an art, it's not a science, it's a craft. And you can have people that are great at science, but they're not very artistic, and therefore they would not be a fit. And likewise, it's still something that requires processes and serious, etc. And so you cannot also have somebody who is just a pure artist. You really need to curate the people that are going to be working on it. One aspect of curation is really about this outsider approach. You want people that are not too sort of too drunk on the Kool-Aid of your company. You want people that maybe come from the outside, joined recently, maybe from a different industry even. And so essentially you have to have people that have an outside perspective and only think about AB InBev during the 9 or 10 hours that they're at work. And then the rest of the time they work on other stuff. They hang out with people from different industries, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to be your best shot. Questions on that?
I have one. What's your view on I like the concept of open innovation, but open innovation versus innovating in capabilities or products through M&A, sorry.
Yeah, well, M&A is actually, a flavor of open innovation, if you will, because you are taking something that's external and bringing it into your overall innovation pipeline. So M&A is absolutely part of open innovation.
Perfect. Thanks.
Cool.
You also mentioned that there is not a single person overseeing the full process. Doesn't make it a little difficult if there is no one orchestrating the whole thing, like an innovation head or something like that?
Great question. I'm glad you asked because I need to clarify that. I don't mean that there shouldn't be a person governing. I think it's fine to have a central person or even a central team that provides governance and guidance, but the execution of innovation needs to be distributed. And so it's fine to have the main person, and sometimes you don't even need a brain. If the CEO is very hands-on and visionary in terms of innovation, that can be him or her. But yeah, you're right. Somebody needs to set the overall guideline, but then the action needs to be in the BUs. Does that make sense? Does that help clarify?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Yep. As a follow-up, I think that's important, especially because then we can have a lot of projects that are in the valley of death and they don't recover from that J curve of return, and we keep them there, right? So
yeah, well, especially one of the big problems in corporate is like you never really run out of money, right? In startups, at some point, if you don't perform, nobody gives you money, and so you have to shut the project. In corporates, there's a big problem, which I call zombie projects. It's like you want to save face, and so you don't really want to admit that the project failed. Maybe you reduce the spending, maybe you rename it, or you say, oh, we're pivoting. It's a different thing, and you end up carrying a lot of dead weight, and you keep a lot of dead weight in that valley of death forever. And so I think one of the key aspects is just accepting failure, and it's fine that projects fail, but you need to call some of it, and some of that can be done by the central apparatus that sets the guideline of like, okay, you have this many years to prove X, Y, and Z. Cool, thank you. Great questions. Final sort of like subchapter. why are we caring about all this? Because it's confusing. This is typically what I see in my inbox, on a weekly or monthly basis. We want to digitalize our processes, our businesses. None of this matters. I think there's a lot of challenges right now with innovation because there's an entire industry of which I am a part of that makes money by making innovation sound more complicated, sell you frameworks, sell you things with complicated words, etc. And actually, none of this matters. What you have to understand is the underlying concept, right? And so there's just one simple thing that I want to convey here is that there's sort of 3 layers of digital transformation, and you can call them whatever you want. I don't have a trademark on any of those names, and I think nobody should. But number 1 is when you do something that is just, let's call it digitization. You have a simple process and it's analog or manual, whatever you want to call it, and you digitize that. We're doing this right now. Normally, when I do this, we're in person in the physical space in San Mateo, and it's great and fun. We can do this right now, so we're doing it on Zoom. That is not digital transformation. That is just digitization or whatever. An example for you guys on the supply side, it's a very light gray here, but basically, if you used to send a form to suppliers, you send an Excel spreadsheet and then you wait for them to respond by email. You can digitize that by putting a web form online, and that way, you suppress the email aspect. It's just like their form entry goes straight into a database. Okay, marginal improvement. Second aspect is when you do digital reimagining. You rethink your process, and maybe you tie a couple of things together and make them work better through the use of digital technologies. And that's great and fine. But really, when we talk about digital transformation, the key aspect that I want to emphasize is ask yourself, is there a way to come up with something that is how would you do this thing? How would you build this business? How would you build this process if you were building it from scratch today with the best technologies that are available? Sort of distance yourself from this is how we do it, this is what the transition plan would be, etc., as a thought exercise. Not saying you're going to have to end up doing that because you can't ignore the past and legacy system, etc., but at least as a thought process, think about how would we build this today? If you were to rebuild the entire company, how would that be done? And so that's where I think a lot of value can be really transformative. This is when you start thinking about those things and not just saying, okay, this meeting is now on Zoom and therefore we've innovated. Let's go a little bit faster here. For second aspect of how to think about innovation, regardless of the degree of innovation you're saying, whether it's simple digitization or all the way to transformative change, you have to see that everything is either a vitamin, a painkiller, or candy. And so a vitamin is something that makes you a little bit better. A painkiller is something that solves a real burning issue, and then a candy is something that everybody's talking about and excited, but actually doesn't do a whole lot. And nobody sells candy. Everybody says, well, actually, this is a vitamin, but there's a lot of candy out there today in the software world, and you have to be careful because they don't actually deliver much return. What's also important to understand is that what's candy for some people is actually a painkiller for somebody else. If you have a massive issue with employee retention, all the stuff that people are doing in Silicon Valley, beer delivery in the office at WeWork, ping pong table, that's candy for most companies. But if you have a massive issue with attracting a particular type of talent or retaining them, that is a legitimate painkiller. And that way, a ping pong table is a legitimate, real solution. It's not a distraction. So always think about the perspective. And so the challenge is that typically we don't really want to listen to the experts because, medicine from doctors, very boring. Sorry, IBM guys, but I fell asleep in the last 5 minutes of the talk. Or you can have vitamins from nutritionists, but it's like, does it really work? And the thing that's a little bit more exciting is buying candies from clowns, but that's actually not what really helps. So again, just try to teach you to be very cynical about all that. All right, let's move on to second chapter, all about the what, and try to define digital transformation a little bit more. Any questions before we move on to that? Comments, pushback? I hope the IBM guys are not around anymore. All right. So, what is digital transformation for growth? What is it for survival? And what is it for innovation's sake? First of all, let's look at the growth stuff. So, growth is king. I'm sure you guys know this, but there are some numbers that really illustrate this. Revenue growth for companies that take an innovation-centric approach to their strategy is 2x that of companies that use other things like pricing power or supply chain optimization. Like, just innovation gets rewarded by your customers. They will buy twice as much. 8 out of the 10 largest market cap companies in the world are tech companies right now. And another thing to consider is that 1/3 of all startup funding comes from a corporate sponsor. And so companies have now realized that innovation, even if it's just sitting on the kids' table of the innovation game by putting a little bit of money here and there into startups, that is still something that delivers potential returns, and you cannot afford not to do it. A couple more numbers. Innovation matters so much, and we know the J curve, we know the valley of death and all of that stuff. It matters so much that you invest in this, that the markets themselves, the public markets, are completely disregarding profitability at this point. On the right-hand side, you can see here the stock performance of companies this year from January to mid-October, I think. There are 416 companies that were losing money, so negative, losses, no profits. Their average return, 57% on that period. On that same period, the S&P 500 is up 8%. And so you can be losing all the money you want as long as the market sees that you're innovative and therefore you're capturing the top line growth, you will be rewarded for it. And so that's another sort of proof point.
Sorry, but the question here related to that statement, I'm wondering whether that also applies for companies like ours, right, that are around already for hundreds of years, or whether that only applies for the more tech innovative companies, new companies. Because, well, we are chasing on, I think, quarterly basis, right? The profitability is still very, very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a fair point. Do you guys pay a dividend?
We do, and our investors.
Yeah, exactly. So, there are other factors that come into it. This is meant more just as a, but, I bet you probably can't go into like, oh, we're going to spend so much money, we're going to lose money, but don't worry, we'll make it up at the end of the J-curve. But you probably could afford to reduce the rate of growth of your EPS if you found a way to grow your top line faster. I bet if you start doing, something like that, I mean, who knows, right? But I would assume that you would be rewarded by the financial markets. But it also depends. I mean, companies like you guys are so big. The people that own your shares, pension funds, mutual funds, stuff like this, they have a different appetite than the retail investors.
Yeah, I think for us is our investors are dividend driven, and I think with these companies is what they want more is like market cap increase or capital gains in the future. So they believe that they can grow 20% if they get the money and they invest that they will get 20% returns like Amazon, and that's why keep the trust in ourselves is they don't believe that we can grow 20%. I think that's why.
Yeah. And you guys are counter-cyclical too. You're a safe bet. Like, people will always be drinking. Party people drink even more during crisis and all of that. So people buy your particular stock for a different decision, for a different reason than they buy the high growth tech stocks. So yeah, good point.
Makes sense.
So some of the reasons why you would do digital transformation or innovation from a growth perspective: come up with new revenue lines, reach new audiences, or have a new way of pricing. Smart TVs, for instance, they sell them sometime at a loss, knowing they will make money eventually on the ads that they serve you or the data that they sell back, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, innovation can be a venue in and of itself to grow your top line, as we talked about. So nothing really crazy here. Again, I put a lot of text in my, it's not slides, but in my slides. You can obviously read that on your own. I'm sure all of you will do that as soon as this is over. I expect the traffic to crash my website, in fact. The second reason why you would want to do innovation is for survival. Frankly, some companies don't have a choice. I don't think you guys are in that category, but there's definitely companies in FMCG that are in that category where they don't have a choice. And so this is something that needs to be understood a little bit better. If you look at this chart of the 12 or 15 largest companies in the 12 largest companies in the world in 2000, there's only 2 tech companies, and eventually in 2018, it's like only 2 non-tech companies. I think there's another graph after this one. I think this one is more interesting, actually. This is the average lifespan of a company on the S&P 500. And so how you read this chart is, let's say, if we take one of the peak, let's say 1990. In 1990, if you were in the S&P 500, the expectation is that you would stay on there for at least 35 years. Now things are changing so fast that in 2020, if you're in the S&P 500, the expectation is that you maybe, if you're lucky, you can stay there 15 years before somebody kicks you out. And so that's one of the reasons why, obviously a lot of that stuff has to happen. It's not just it's not just a matter of growing. In some cases, it's a matter of literally keep on surviving. There's also a great example, especially from public markets, because enterprise value these days is very driven by just growth and innovation. And so Tesla, great example, market share less than 1%, market cap bigger than I think almost all of the other OEMs combined. Facebook, over the news industry, Facebook stock versus every single newspaper in the world is worth, a lot more, etc. And so you have to sort of understand that. So some of the things that you may want to do via transformation as a way to survive. One is channel migration. If your customers are going somewhere else to buy, well, you need to be that somewhere else. And if that somewhere else is digital, then you don't really have a choice, right? If everybody's starting to order groceries on Instacart, well, right now you're not too challenged because Instacart still goes to the grocery store and the grocery store still has your product, and your product may be in the end caps and all of that. But now the end caps don't matter because somebody who's shopping is just looking at their phone and saying, oh, this is the beer I'm supposed to pick up. And so maybe you need to migrate, and all the money you spend to make sure that the retailer, your beer bottles are making a sign of the local football team. You need to find somehow a way to do that on Instacart. That way people sort of have the same behaviors in the digital world as they do with like the impulse purchase, because, this is the closest case of beer to my hand when I'm walking through the store. It could be a matter of productivity gap reduction. If you have legacy systems that are becoming significantly worse than how people are doing in the rest of your industry, especially people that are born digital, you have to keep up. Otherwise, essentially, that's going to become a hidden reason why your SG&A cost and others are spiraling out of control. And you'll have, essentially, without necessarily even realizing it, you'll start bleeding out from that side. And then finally, there's going to be a customer experience modernization. In some cases, I like this example of iTunes. Customers for decades were happy to buy a whole album. It was like, okay, I'm going to buy this CD or this vinyl. It's 20 songs by this band. But then that was kind of already different from, how we consume on the radio. On the radio, you only listen to 1 or 2 songs by an artist and it's somebody else, etc. And so Apple with iTunes realized that and figured out that people didn't want to buy a whole album. They wanted to buy 1 song at a time. And that's how iTunes came to be, and really took a lot of money away from the music industry. And then Spotify realized people want to be able to listen to any songs. And so you have to see, like, what is the expectation in your world? Maybe in your world, it's that people don't know what kind of beer. I mean, I know I'm a big beer drinker. I think 1,200 beers on Untappd. But basically, in a perfect world, I would just order a beer and a drone would deliver it at the right temperature, but I don't know what beer it's going to be. It's depending on what I'm watching or what I'm eating, etc., etc. So we're not there yet, but that's sort of like an extrapolation of what that could mean for people like you, right? If the expectation is that I don't want to buy a pack a week in advance and I want to instead have things on demand, then what does that mean to your business, for instance? And then finally, there is innovation for innovation's sake. This one I like to emphasize because sometimes people think that, it's obviously a waste of time. That's the same thing as doing blockchain for your employee badges. But there's actually a couple positives here. Let's start with the negatives because they're more fun. Number one negative of just doing innovation because your boss asks you to it, repainting. I've suffered from that. I've worked for people that, the CEO says we have to be innovative. And what they do is they look at their P&L and say, well, can we rename this thing? Can we make it sound more innovative? And essentially what you do, you end up sort of like you dilute the understanding of what innovation is. You create a lot of negative goodwill. People really start being highly cynical of the whole process, et cetera, et cetera. So do not do that. Second thing, cargo culting. Are you guys familiar with cargo cults? Cargo cults are a funny and sad phenomenon that happen in the Pacific Islands, where a lot of those countries, Vanuatu and whatever, they had not been discovered yet, but world trade was already happening. And so what was happening is sometimes you had a shipping container that would fall off a boat, and weeks later it would wash off on a beach on an island with Aborigines and all of that stuff. They had no idea where it came from. That was literally their first exposure to the modern world. Maybe there was a bunch of cases of beer in there. And so they thought it was a gift from the gods. And so they started essentially, praying to the cargo and thinking, if we do X, Y, and Z, if we sacrifice a goat, maybe God will send us another cargo full of beer. And there's a lot of that going on in innovation. There's a lot of companies that it's like, I went to this talk by this guy with a weird French accent. It was great. And now we're going to do Scrum. I don't know what that means. We're going to do it. We're going to do it every week. And so don't do that. Don't do cargo culting. Don't start, memorizing a couple of keywords and playing innovation bingo in your next meeting, etc. So that's one of the risks of doing innovation for innovation's sake. And those two sort of combine for the distraction aspect. If you do too much wasteful or useless innovation, you end up burning out a lot of goodwill. And so don't do that. But that said, it's possible to do innovation just for the sake of doing it and actually get decent results. One aspect of it is talent. Google's a great example of that. They attracted a lot of top talent because they told them, you're going to work a lot of boring stuff, page rank, serving ads, etc. But you can spend 20% of your time working on whatever you want. And so that's a good positive of telling people you can innovate on, we know some of the stuff you're going to do is not super fun, but you can also have a lot of fun on the side, and it's completely sanctioned by the company. Second thing is market intelligence and related point of unexpected ideas. Serendipity and just doing stuff is the best way to learn. I'll just move on real quick. There's a quote, I think. Oh, no, it's not there. There's a quote by Johnny Ive, lead designer at Apple for a very long time, said something along the lines of, when you build something, it's great because at the end of it, you have the thing, but you also have all the learnings that you've had from the process of building it. And so I think sometimes, maybe doing blockchain for your employee badges is a really dumb idea. But if that means that you have, 5 people that become really hooked on blockchain, really good at it, and come up with an idea, maybe not for your employees, but realizing that, with some vendors or whatever, it might make sense, then it was all worth it. And so don't necessarily discount innovation for innovation's sake is all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I would also add that Google point, right, about working on the project. That's actually how Gmail was born. So there is actually not only for the talent retention, but there's also there are a lot of things that coming out of it, and even some companies, like for example Cisco, they would have internal innovation championship where they would have about like 100 teams joining for some innovation every year, and it's not really focused on anything particular. It's just a good idea that Cisco ended up investing like 3 to 5 ideas and let people work on it as their side project, and that's the way that they sort of kind of encourage their employees to try new innovative things, because they reward this innovation, they reward this looking at the problem for the different level, from the different scale.
Yeah, thank you. Good point. All right. Final chapter. How? So how do we make this happen? We understand why, we understand what it is. So now the big question is how to do it. Let's go into it. First, strategy. How do we actually do it? There's actually a few tools that are great. I like to make fun of them, but I also have to admit that they're very strong. And so these are some typical things that you may want to be aware of. The first one is Lean Canvas. And I'm sure you've heard of it. If I hover over it, you should see. Do you see when I hover over, you see that little graph?
Yes.
And so this is a simple yet powerful framework on how to quickly validate an idea as a business. It's like, oh, what if we did this? Okay, well then how would we make money? Why would it be different? What are the partners? What would it cost, etc. So it's a useful framework. I'm not going to go into it. Frankly, this would deserve an entire talk in and of itself, and I'm guessing a lot of you already are familiar. Second aspect, design thinking, also extremely useful. I saw some of the comments that came from you guys in the questionnaire where about, how do we come up with new ideas, etc. Well, design thinking is sort of design, pun intended, to that end. It's really all about using empathy as a way to discover what people may want, etc., etc. And then there is an execution sort of driven framework from a strategy perspective that I think is very useful, as well as agile. And so agile comes from the development world, but it can be applied to a lot of other things, although I think it's been overdone in some sectors a little bit. But nevertheless, it's just the idea that instead of having a big plan and having essentially very few milestones between point A and point B, and never sort of deviating to what point B is supposed to be, you break down everything into much smaller goals, and you have a very guided approach every few weeks or whatever to actually reach a particular decision point to either iterate or keep going in the same direction. So those are all fine. There's one that I sort of came up with on my own. It's not a real framework in and of itself, but it's a way to think about it. And I like to call it the 3D model of innovation portfolio. And it is really based on the idea that innovation, or innovation strategy in particular, needs to be like a stock portfolio. We have people that are understanding of the stock market in this meeting. And so that if you're 25 years old and you are 55, you don't invest in the same type of companies, you don't invest with the same expectations, and et cetera, right? Your innovation strategy also needs to reflect where you are as an organization. Is AB InBev a 25-year-old hipster with limited income, or is AB InBev a 55-year-old male with a lot of income, but also, expectation of living on annuities, like dividends and all that stuff? And so you would invest differently from a stock portfolio perspective, and likewise, you will invest differently from an innovation perspective. What does matter, though, in those three dimensions is that you do things that are coherent. And so the three dimensions, first of all, you have the approaches. What are some of the activities or some of the building blocks of your innovation? Are you just doing purely a dedicated team? Are you doing an innovation center of excellence? Are you doing things like a hackathon, or are you doing an excursion? Like if you were all in San Francisco today, meaning we meet in person. None of those things are right. None of them are wrong. They all just sort of like depends. Sometimes we deal with companies that have very limited, to put it mildly, level of maturities with regard to innovation. And so doing just an excursion, having 20 people go to SVIC and just sort of like show them a teaser about what it can be, is extremely helpful. But if you're an organization that's already very mature in that regard, then you need to do something else. Maybe then you want to do something like university partnership to start getting access to the top talent, maybe getting the ability to do exclusive licensing of key patents and stuff like that. So it all depends on where you are. The second aspect is the areas of innovation, and I think you covered that in another talk that I usually come after. This is like, are you trying to innovate, some of the internal aspects of your business, some of the external aspects of your business, that would be the experience, or just like the core product of your business. And so likewise, none of those things are either right or wrong. It's just like what makes the most sense for you. You start maybe thinking in the back of your mind, like what matters is not so much picking and choosing different things, but also having some degree of cohesiveness between them. You cannot overdo it in your customer engagement experience while having a crappy product or crappy internal processes. And so you need to make sure that none of those links in the chain become significantly weaker than the others. Otherwise, you're essentially wasting your time by overdoing it somewhere else. And then the final aspect, I think, is usually well understood, is the magnitude of innovation. Are you doing something? This is a classic, MBA type 2x2. Are you doing something where you are serving existing customers with an existing product? In a case like that would be, launching a new brand of beer. And so that's fine. That could be innovative and, maybe a slightly different flavor, whatever. This is the example for Amazon, for instance, what it would look like for them. Or are you doing like a new product but serving an existing market? I think you guys started a hard seltzer brand recently, right? Yeah, so that would be an example right here of expand. It's like you're still selling to the same people, but it's a new product line. And then you have other aspects like going into, potentially new markets or whatever. And then the type of innovation that does get a lot of attention and is perfectly fine, and that's where you get the most returns, but it's also where you get the most risk, is the transformative one. It's going into completely new markets. It's in your industry. That's like when PepsiCo and Frito-Lay's combine, right? It's like beverages and then boom, going into food, new markets, new distribution channels, etc., etc. Also, although you could argue that they were serving the same customers at the end of the day. So what matters is really more about making it coherent. You don't want to have a strategy or 3D model that is completely incoherent, where you do things that are very advanced on one front, like licensing a lot of IP, which is great, very advanced, and also very long-term oriented, but having most of your innovation goals be very short-term related and marketing related. That just makes no sense. You're doing those two things that almost like butt head with one another. You could do it in a way that's suboptimal, really good at one thing, but not great overall. And so that's just doing, maybe micro level innovation. Or you could do like the ultimate machine, right? You could do where everything makes perfect sense, things come in the right sequence, one after the other, and you'll chain overall all the links are strengthening each other, basically all together at the same time. And so that's sort of what you should aim for. That's the gist of the model, is not to tell you could do a hackathon or whatever. It's just to think like when you're doing all those things, make sure that they make sense and they coalesce well together. Questions? Comments? Pushback? Happy hour? Okay. All right. Let's talk about the execution. We said, okay, strategy is fine, but really it's all about execution. There's a couple things to mention. First, there's a quote. I love quotes, and this one is one that I really appreciate, even though it actually doesn't come from anyone tied to innovation. She's an author, I think, anthropologist and philanthropist, but for some reason she said this: the world needs dreamers and the world needs doers. But above all else, what the world needs most are dreamers that do. And so that's what you have to take away. Like, you can't just think, you know what, I spent a week at Silicon Valley Innovation Center and now I have all those ideas, etc. You have to have at the same time that same drive to say, like, and this is how I'm going to make it happen. There's a cool framework that I stumbled upon. I did not make that up. This is somebody a lot smarter than me that came up with it, but I think it's really great and really illustrative. If you have to think about ideas and execution as a multiplication function. And so a horrible idea is worth $0, and horrible execution is worth a multiplying factor of 0. I think you kind of see where this goes. A great idea is $1 million idea, but if you don't know what to do with it, then it's basically worthless. If you have a bad idea and very good execution, you can still do like $1 million. All the numbers are fictional, just for illustration, right? Actually, it's kind of funny because $1 million is the $1 million homepage. $1 million homepage was in, I don't know, 20 years ago. Some guy built a web page. There was 1 million pixels on the page, and he sold each pixel for $1 to advertisers. Maybe Bud was one of the advertisers. Some of them bought, multiple pixels to make a logo or something. So great example, right? Bad idea, but done very well, $1 million. And then you have great ideas that are very good ideas that have horrible execution. A lot of startups end up obviously dead broke. And then you have obviously what happens when you have great idea and great execution, and also not by design, but we arrive at 1 trillion if you do this multiplication, and that happens to be the market cap for Amazon. So not the worst coincidence. One of the key aspects of making innovation happen, and it's a soft aspect of execution, because I think the hard aspect of execution really are so specific to each company. I feel it would be presumptuous for me to start telling you how to run your beverage business. So I prefer to talk about sort of like higher level stuff. But one I care deeply about, especially because I see how messed up it is at many companies, is this nuance of safe to fail versus fail safe. So safe to fail is this very Silicon Valley dogma of saying, you should fail often, fail fast, and learn from it, and then you keep building on top of that. Unfortunately, lots of people in the rest of the world have read all the right books, but they mistranslated them, and it took it to mean fail safe. What fail safe means is more like an engineering concept where you overdo all the systems of defense and protection to make sure nothing catastrophic happens. So I'm not that smart. I prefer to use simpler example. We're going to use this example of a lady on a high wire. The startup way, the safe to fail way, is if you want her to be able to walk across 2 high buildings on a high wire, the first version of your test should be that you make her walk 2 centimeters off the ground. That's safe to fail. If she falls, she's not going to hurt herself. And then, you move up 5 centimeters, 2 meters, etc., etc. That is the right way to do it. That is the right culture to build innovation and to have people not be afraid of executing on innovation. Fail safe is what 90% of large companies do. They have the same goal: tall buildings, lady, high wire, she has to walk. So what do? They buy the 2 buildings, they put the high wire, and then they start training her, corporate training, in a conference room somewhere, reading about how to do a high wire walking, and then they give her a parachute. They put people with a big mattress at the bottom, and they think that means safe to fail. No, that just means you built a lot of fail safes and you spend time and money doing that. So that's sort of that nuance. Another key thing to take.
Could you sorry, may I ask a question? Could you have do you have any good examples like of the companies who like really have this as a culture aspect, and how it's finally introduced in a kind of practical things? Like, for example, we asked this question for one of the speakers from Amazon last week. So because he actually made the statement that this is a part of the company culture and so on. But then when we start to deep dive, at the end, we realized that, okay, from the target setting perspective, so it's still very strict. So you could not fail. Then you will lose your targets, I don't know, bonus, whatever. So from business planning perspective, also, they have quite a strict business planning rules. So like you have to budget everything in advance. Putting it in a targets also from the budget perspective. So you have to commit in advance, like, what the budget you are requesting, meaning that you also should commit in advance the payback, I don't know, whatever. So at the end, it's nice statement. And we hear it like, from right and left, and also from time to time in our companies as well. But it's also a bit always a question, how practically being executed in the companies, and do you know any good examples or like kind of examples which could illustrate that the company really found a way how to make this statement live in their organization?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. I think the simplest type of example to think about that is just to start small and to start with pilots. A case that I lived a couple times. I was buying software companies for UL, and so I acquired 7 different software companies, and most of them were typical old school software companies, meaning you bought a perpetual license. You pay $250,000 and you have access to the software. And then after 3 years, we have to call you and try to convince you that the new version is better and then you should buy it. We knew that the world was moving to SaaS, where people wanted to pay, something monthly, and the software is upgraded all the time. And so the traditional corporate way would have been to say, okay, well, on January 1st, 2015, we're going to switch everyone to SaaS. And this is the fail safe we're going to put in place with accounting to make sure that the collections are going fine. On the technology side, to make sure the cloud migration is done. This would have been like the old school way of doing it. Instead, what they did is realize, okay, let's find 10 customers that we think are most likely to be very willing to make that change to, paying monthly a smaller fee, having everything in the cloud, etc. And let's start with them. Because you take customers that are friendly, if that fails, they'll be more friendly in the feedback. They're not going to immediately jump to a different provider, etc., etc. And then eventually you use the learnings from them because nothing ever goes right. to make it better for the next wave of 50 customers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one, simpler way, just do it on a small thing. In cases like you guys where you're moving real products, it is sometimes a lot more difficult. And sometimes what you have to do is just you do a period of redundancy. Let's say you're doing some, and I'm sure you've done it in the past, actually, you didn't even necessarily think about it, but you may have in the past, I don't know, optimized a warehouse software or something. And what you probably did is you run two software, the old one and the new one, concurrently for a few weeks. That was sort of like your version of doing safe to fail. You knew that if the new one had the issues, you had the fallback of the original one. And you also probably deployed it at one warehouse at a time, not all of them at the same time. So you're probably doing it already, I hope.
Yeah, we do. It's like, more like the question of, because, okay, let's imagine I will do the pilot in the beginning of next year, and the pilot, the results will look great. Then I will come and ask the money, biggest budget for the further rollout. No one will give it to me. It's too late. I need to ask this money, I don't know, a quarter before, because of the planning cycle of the company. So, then whatever good pilots I would have, I would not get money for continuation. So in this case, that's why I'm saying that in one hand, it's good. And we are launching the pilot. So we are like, trying a bit to play with that rules by saying, yeah, okay, something will go well, and just try to book and pre-book the money in advance with certain risk to be failed. And then, but at the end, I'm just also thinking, because it's a good challenge and provocation for us, how in one hand convinced our people to be more provocative and not to afraid to make it in one hand, but on the other hand support it with them by right cycling, but right rules, right things like this. So that's a bit the point.
Yeah, I mean, normally there's some slack in the budget, but the size of the slack may depend quite a bit. I mean, I know, like with UL, when we created the corporate venture fund, literally we pitched
I was just going to say that.
What's that?
No. I was just going to say about the venture capital approach, right? When you actually have a fund that is sort of like allocated, you can distribute or you can actually keep it.
Yeah, and so even the creation of the fund, you would think it would be the same thing. It's like, oh, well, Matthew and Simon want to create a venture fund now, but that's not in the budget. So we have to wait, until next planning cycle, etc. No, instead, what we did is we went to the CEO, and we knew the CEO, and UL is a $2 billion company. So you guys are what, 10, 20 times bigger, something like that, probably, in revenue, 2 billion in revenue. And our CEO has a 30 million discretionary budget, meaning the board is given him license for 30 million blank check every year, and he can allocate for things that were not initially planned. And so, if we wanted to do something extremely drastic, if we wanted to reinvent our lab management software, yes, we probably would need to wait and fit that into the traditional cycle, etc. But you can still be pretty ambitious with the amount of slack that an organization have if you find the right champion. The other thing that I would say, and I don't mean that as necessarily pushback, but just if you are an organization where you don't have that amount of slack and everything is regimented to that degree, etc., then I would argue that maybe on one dimension, the governance dimension or the executive guidance direction, that's your weak link in your innovation strategy, and that link is not good enough. They're not forward looking enough yet to support an ambitious project like whatever it is, the one you are pitching. And so you need to reinforce that link first, educate your executives before you can get their full support for a bigger project.
Okay, thanks.
And I can also give an example for how Goldman did it, right? So exactly what they did, they had a venture fund allocated, and they had sort of like LP, the traditional venture fund allocated, but they also had the internal venture fund allocated. And what the idea was, right, is that it is there, but it's really just a part of sort of cash management, right? So for example, Treasury, they would definitely keep a lot of cash on hand in the form of liquid securities. And what they said is that, you have like, let's say Matthew, in your example, $30 million allocated towards those innovation initiatives per year, right? And then it doesn't mean that it's actually, it's taken out of the account and it's put, let's say, Olga, in your personal account, so you can go and waste and spend it or not spend, right? It is really just sort of this soft commitment saying, we're still managing the cash, we're still having all those reserves, but like, let's say $30 million of those reserves could be allocated towards those projects. They could be allocated, could be not allocated. That's absolutely fine. But I think the idea behind it, what actually made it work, is that every time those money were sort of drawn out of it, there was a meeting where we would all come together and actually discuss those things. Should we give out those money? And it was really sort of this venture capital process, as the general partners would vet every project on the sort of venture capital perspective. And then if everyone was vetted, then those goals were set up, right? We expect that if we pick up $5 million to invest into this company, this is how it's going to materialize, in 2 or 3 years. And with the same approach, and only then we were kind of the people who were kind of approving it. Well, not me, but I was a part of the team who was approving it. Then we were on the hook to deliver those based on that budget. But what it was, it's what exactly Matthew said. It was the funds set aside, but again, they were not set aside in form of just a blank check. It was actually just a part of reserves that could be used for those innovation projects, or could not be used. I think like in 3 years I was involved in this, we never actually once depleted that fund.
Yeah. Final thing on that, just before we move on to make sure we hit the time, but it also depends. Like if you're trying to pitch candy, to go back to that analogy, yeah, you probably have to wait. If you're pitching vitamins, again, but in some cases, like if you have a tumor growing in your brain, you're not going to say, well, I only allocated this amount of money for the doctor this year, so I'll wait until next. If you can make a compelling argument to your executives, like if we don't make this change, this is the impact. Like there's a real opportunity cost of waiting. Most executives, I won't say all, but I will say most, have arrived to where they are because they're really sharp. And at the end of the day, they can understand that. They can understand the concept of opportunity cost. And but I know it's difficult. I know getting the time with the right people, etc., is a challenge. I don't mean to dismiss the challenge at all. Couple final things on execution.
Just one question. I think that, just to complement what Olga was saying, I think it's not a matter of resources, but I think it's a matter of maybe risk aversion and having the proper routines. I think that's maybe at the C-suite, the level of risk aversion is less,
Yeah.
but when you go down through the organization, like senior managers, like middle managers, lower level managers, the risk aversion increases significantly, I think.
Yeah, it's very well known that middle layer is definitely for almost everything, right? Not just for innovation, but for any sort of change management. It is known that the middle layer is always the obstacle. That's where all the inertia resides. Good point. On the matter of execution, just one quick thing, because I know we talk about, especially when you think about design thinking and agile, it's easy to get confused and think, oh, well, basically it means, you start doing stuff and then you change all the time and it's okay. One caveat, I think it's okay in the early stages of a project to make a lot of zigzagging and changing and all of that, but if you actually want to execute well, at some point the path has to narrow. And so I cannot emphasize that enough. I love to always say, well, here's a counterpoint, here's a tangent, what if this, what if that? At some point, and that's also why I'm not nearly as gifted in the execution side as some of my colleagues, and vice versa. You need a different type of skill set, a different side of mindset to drive the execution, and at the end, it needs to resemble more of a straight line. You don't want too many changes of direction in that case. Some key factors to actually execute well. Number one, get some help. Sometimes just having external validation, a third party. In the old days when you were doing cost reduction, you brought in McKinsey or Bain, and they would say the same thing as the lower people, but because they had the McKinsey badge, your CEO would listen to them. Well, now it's the same thing. Just bring, a big name like IDEO or something like that, and actually that will help you make the point across. The other thing, and we talked about that, start today, yesterday if you can, but if you can go back to yesterday, you have a time machine and you don't need really a lot of more help on innovation side, but start as early as you can. Don't wait until next year, don't wait until next planning cycle, etc. And then the final thing that I think a lot of people struggle with, set visible goals. It's okay if you're going to fail against some of them, but to create that sort of like shared vision, shared understanding of where we're trying to go, and also because that's what you're supposed to do for Agile, you have to be very transparent about this is what we're trying to accomplish. You cannot just have like fuzzy goals like, oh, we're going to be more innovative. Here is that quote I was looking for, just 20 slides too late. And here are some resources that I wanted you guys to walk away with. So usually I'm one of the first speakers, I think, in those programs. This is actually kind of fitting that I'm the last for this one, because here are a few things that I want you guys to take away. I hope some of you are already doing this, but usually when I'm in person, I do a little test of raising people's hand, and I say, okay, well, how many of you read the news from your industry? So, beer magazine and all that stuff. And then everybody raises their hand. Okay, well, how many of you read news, magazines, publications about your job, like Supply Chain Magazine or HR Magazine or Accountant Diary or whatever? And it's only about half of them. And then if I ask, okay, well, how many of you reads about tech in general? And I get basically everybody suddenly gets paralyzed and no hand goes up. It is essential if you're going to be driving innovation, you have to have that outside perspective. You cannot just effectively innovate from within just by hanging out with people from your industry, or even worse, people just from the one company. And so here are a few resources that I think can be helpful. Some of them are more on like analytical side, whether it's databases to see where is the money going, what startups are getting fundraising, which sectors are hot, which ones are not. Some of them are more like to create that aspect of serendipity, which places to go, which meetups to attend, etc., where you're going to bump into the right people to essentially meet somebody that says something that inspires you, etc., etc. But overall, I think a comprehensive, again, portfolio-like approach to your continuing education of innovation is essential. If you think this is a vaccine and you get your booster shot today by coming here, and then you can wait 5 years before you take another innovation class or learn about a new tech, you're in for the world of hurt. You have to do this not every day, but you have to do this every week. It has to become part of what you do. You have to read about what's happening. You have to be in the right places, and you have to bump into the right people if you really want to be a capable innovator. So that's I think that's pretty much what I have. We have some time for questions, and then you'll find some more resources and my contact information at the bottom of the page. And for now, let's just see what we have in a matter of question. I think we have about 10 minutes or so. I actually don't have a hard stop, so however much you guys want to torture me, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add on top. We actually last year, not this year, but had several clients to which we sort of send on the weekly basis. We send those innovation intelligence report, right? It's like, okay, those are the startups that belong to your space. Those are some of the interesting trends that are happening. Those are some recent venture capital raises. They were actually for the fintech, so we're really focusing on sort of this venture capital validation, and that was one of the pieces of the intelligence we sent sort of to the C-suite and to their innovation team.
I think you can also sort of subscribe, because I have like Owler or I don't know, PitchBook. They would send you stuff that you're interested in. Right? That's the other thing that helps.
Yeah. Definitely. Any questions?
I have one.
Please.
I wanted, we operate in a sort of in a very global footprint, and a big part of our strongholds are in developing countries like Africa, Latin America, etc. And they're naturally, or I don't know if naturally, but they are less advanced in terms of innovation. How do you see that turning out? Because that will affect us as well.
Yeah. We actually had the same question a few days ago with regard to Africa in particular. I do think that constraints in some way is very helpful. When I'm in person again, there's an exercise I like to do with people. I tell people, okay, just grab a blank sheet of paper and draw something. You can guess what people do. 90% of people will draw a house on a hill with a nice pointy roof and a fireplace, a chimney with some smoke coming out. And so that's what everyone draws. And then I say, okay, grab another sheet of paper, and then I give a constraint. Say, okay, now you can draw something, but it needs to be made only of triangles or circles or whatever. And then you start people creating, abstract stuff. There's always somebody that wants to be funny and makes a house just made from triangles and all of that. But constraints can actually be liberating in some way. There's been a ton of innovation going on in Africa with regard to mobile payment. I mean, mobile payment was first working in Africa before we started doing it. I mean, I would say COVID is really the one thing that started making mobile payments happen in North America. But in Africa, they've been doing it for a while. So yes, they have some limitations in terms of the infrastructure that they have, even the level of tech savviness of the average consumer or the average partner you may have over there, the distributors, your bottlers, etc. But in some ways, there's also different expectations. And so if you marry those different expectations with the constraints that they bring, you may find that sort of go back to that, way earlier in this talk, we talked about digital transformation is like, if you really think about what if I had to rebuild this entire stack today with the technology that's available, you have to do that almost for that region. Don't try to bring European or American process and say, okay, well, how do we make this in Africa? And it doesn't work. It's like, okay, well, beer, people, Africa. This is what
I disagree with that Africa, because I live in South Africa, and actually the best banking app I ever had has been in South Africa, compared to the countries that started earlier and they don't want to change the infrastructure because changing certain things is harder. And I think we are sometimes in that place that we have already a lot of systems that were bought 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and then changing is harder for us than the one that doesn't have any system. So if you don't have anything, you can buy the latest one, right?
Exactly.
And so you agree, because that's what I said. I said, I think Africa is great on mobile payments. They're best in the world because they didn't bother thinking, well, how do we do ACH transactions? Like, no, let's just do mobile phones. We have mobile phones. Let's just do that.
Yeah, and electricity by prepaid electricity, for instance, you can have it in rural places in Africa. And also surprising how the mobile, how the people use the mobiles because they don't have other networks. And so I think sometimes, yes, I agree with you, is the constraints.
I fully understand you, Paula. So also the same feeling after Russia in Europe. Believe me, it's killing me. It's killing me.
Yes.
I moved. I moved from Russia 15 years ago, and when I looked at the mobile systems, at the mobile telephone systems here, I was like, huh? You're doing what?
Yes.
But I think just compliment. I think scarcity brings creativity. Right? I was thinking maybe you do that like phone banking because banks are not trusted or they are not there. I was thinking when you were saying that, Matthew, I was thinking of India and stuff like Paytm to pay stuff because a lot of people don't have bank accounts, but they do have a cell phone and you can do like simpler stuff.
Actually, Goran shared with us the nice example in kind of this Cafe Connect session. So he said in China, because he worked quite a lot of time in China, he said he made the video when the guy who is I don't know how to say it in English, klashar guy who is asking the money in the streets. So the really the guy who has has nothing. So he really was asking to send to his mobile phone to the people around, some virtual money because no one has a cash, and this is the easiest way to him to actually get money from the people from the streets. So it's actually amazing. So how it's different.
Yeah, and I would also add, right, is that it's sort of interesting, and talking about those pilots, right, is that pretty much like going into the new market is by the definition already has that risk baked in, right? So maybe some of those pilots, pretty much everything that you do in a new country, in a new geographic region is a pilot, right? So that's like one of the ways to think about it.
Yeah,
Diana, I saw you several times going on mute. Do you have anything to add?
Oh, hey. here I am. No, I was gonna say, yeah, like I remember, yeah, Gordon's example with the homeless and the beggars in China. No, but I was gonna say, like maybe on the innovation side, as far as product innovation, like I think that we figure it out with the Venture OS, like go seed, launch, and grow. But then on the system side, I believe that we should follow the same process, like seed, launch, and grow. And I think that we saw it with the KEX tracking technology that we piloted. It was a seed, we failed, but we had a lot of learnings that then the second time that we went on a pilot on a different market, it worked out well. And now the use cases are even, like, what is that, like growing. But one of the things that we do in ZX that you were kind of referring, both of you, with respect to the venture fund, is that once we seed a product, we have to keep track of all KPIs, the return on the sales, the rate of sale, the service level, like so many mostly commercial KPIs. And then every 3 months, every quarter, we'll have to go in front of the investment committee. And really the discussion is, do we keep the project going or do we kill it? So we are assessing the seed phase and the launch phase every quarter. So if the project is really picking up and we're seeing the returns that we need to have, okay, we invest, but we have to go there and pitch for these projects. It's not that is a check at the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
So I think that for sure we need to create something like that, like an investment committee for technology and a different approach on how to grow these projects.
So
I just have, I think we do projects. We have a lot of areas that are doing projects and pilots, and we do have a beer garage, and I think there are amazing things that they are doing. But I think in the day-to-day life, maybe is that part of having either the budget on Flavia's that she can have projects, but also where we squeeze our operations. So I don't know if the guys have ideas where they can have the time to also bring ideas, and that doesn't feel like extra work, because we also put targets on the ideas or things like that. I don't know if is the space that we are.
And sometimes even to have the people to execute the pilots, because at certain moment, I remember last year we are doing this explore agenda, and there was a lot of let's say companies that were interested to do pilots, and at certain moment we said no, we need to focus a bit, and we because we don't have a unlimited resource neither. So yeah. But the balance of it in terms of having ideas and like a group that is bringing and exploring, and a group that is really working on the machine and the right profile for mixing the both as well, I think is the challenge to find, because the idea as such we do have, but if we are already in a structural level, that's the point, or in a mature level of this process.
Yeah. One of the challenges with metrics is you cannot have the same metrics for an innovation project as you can for everything else. And so when I hear you guys say that, we tried this thing, but then it has to go to an investment committee and it's judged by the same metrics, the return on sales, etc., like that scares me. That is something that is detrimental to the innovation. Unless you're talking about, very simple incremental innovation, maybe, again, a new flavor or whatever, but if you're doing any sort of real meaningful innovation, part of your proposal when you're pitching an innovation idea should be, this is how I think we should measure it. Whenever you're pitching an innovation, you need to also pitch, what do you think is the right metric to gauge how it's going? Because if you're using if you're using the same metrics that mature businesses are using to measure themselves, you're never going to be successful. When I started the digital business unit at UL, the UL was growing about 10% every year, and the EBITDA margin was about 17%. And so that was kind of like all the traditional BUs were supposed to hit somewhere in that ballpark. but my BU was losing money because we kept investing in a product, etc. But we had set the goal. It's like, okay, look, we're going to lose money, but this is the type of growth we're going to have on the top line. If we
Yeah,
had
no,
been,
Matthew, I totally agree with you. And I think that the triggers are different. So for example, the number of bucks that we need to achieve in seed is much different than the one that we need to achieve in grow. So if we were able to sell a product in 250 stores, we did it. Like, you know, but then 250 stores is nothing if, you know, for ABI. So yeah, like I totally agree with you. The triggers are very different, or the targets are very different.
Yeah, and I want to add, Flavia, to your point, right? Is that it's almost Indiana. Let me just back me up here. So as far as I understand, right? So you sort of lead that innovation, and you have your own sort of separate budget that is separate from, let's say, Flavia's budget, or let's say from her peers' budget. And I think what some companies are trying to do, they're trying to sort of like open the fund to some of the ideas, right? So everyone can sort of introduce their own ideas and introduce their own thinking, right? And there is sort of like monetary reward for doing that. And that's what some companies have been doing, and what we've been advising some companies to do. So sort of allocate this, discretionary fund that would source the internal ideas, internal innovation, have this internal competition from every other group, and see which one wins. And you give them a little bit more of the budget, and you sort of reward them for that additional work.
I would say for, like there are so many different streams going on in the company. And I think that maybe this is one of the things that, like slows innovation. But I will say, like taking as an example, the 100 Plus Accelerator. Are you guys aware of that one? So the 100 Plus Accelerator is to pilot ideas with small companies, with the startups, related to sustainability. So, and you can go to a website, it's called 100 Plus Accelerator. So what we do is that we partner with these companies, and we give to these companies the opportunity to pilot in our breweries, or in our, with us in whatever places in the world. And then if the pilot is successful, then we start investing in those companies. And then we even bring those companies to other investors, because the problem most likely is not going to be just for ABI, but it's going to be for, like the world. I think that on the technology side, and it would have been great to have somebody from solutions here, like Santiago or whoever.
We have
but
Paola.
I am.
Paola, yeah, you're like the representative. Yeah, but like
Yes.
from the technology side, at least we have another process from like Kramer, and Brito, like with champions. If somebody has a great idea, they can bring up the idea, and if you need capex and you have an RO, the company might invest on this idea. But it's different because we're looking for efficiencies. So we will invest for efficiencies, but not invest for innovation, which is, I don't think that on the larger company, it exists, to what I understand.
Yeah, I was thinking on that we don't have the, when you were putting the positive, when Matthew was putting the positives on the innovation for the innovation's sake, like to learn with innovation, to do a project that maybe is not super related to the efficiencies, but it will teach us how to deal with, I don't know, APIs, power ups, something that is just to learn something, maybe is a silly thing, and a group of people learn, then they can take a different project later on, or how a project works. I think that will be interesting if we can allocate some sort of budget for the especially the people that are young and is coming with new ideas. Normally those are the ones that their ideas die 1 year later.
Yeah, for internal innovation, right? Internal innovation, internal acceleration.
Yeah, like in our global team, we set up money for pilots. That was the only thing that we had. I couldn't scale it without the zones. So my money was really for my small pilots.
All right.
I had a question just for Matthew. Sorry. How long an idea, so what is the amount of time that an idea needs to grow? Or when do you think that the idea, because also that happens, that many people have great ideas, but then should the idea start jump in directly? I know you can start small and safe, but how much do you think an idea can, to be mature enough to jump it to the next stage on your experience?
I mean, I think doing some degree of execution extremely fast is really good, because even as you're trying to convince other people that it's a good idea, showing that you've done something is a lot more powerful. It's a lot more powerful for two reasons. Number one, it anchors the idea a little bit. The worst thing you can do is you have a great idea yourself, and then you go pitch it to two people, and because it's just an idea, they give you feedback and say, well, I'll support you if you do X, Y, and Z. And then it becomes this weird hybrid that's diluted. And so it helps you anchor the idea and retain truth. If you do even just something simple, say, I have this great idea, and I talked to two of our clients. I talked to this retailer in South Africa, and I talked to whatever. Just having a little bit of that external sort of anchoring will be helping you. So the speed will depend obviously on the type of idea, the type of organization that you are, but I don't think you can really move too fast, especially if you take it slow, right? Yes, you could move too fast if you overdo something at very early stage, but you cannot move too fast to do at least a little bit.
Yeah, and I would also add to this, right, and to sort of back on the Matthew standpoint, and sort of like putting the venture capital one, right, is that when you come to the idea with this kind of startup to the venture capitalists, the one thing they will be looking for is, well, two things they will be looking for. They're going to be team who's actually executing, and traction, right? What traction do you have? What kind of metrics? What have you done? Right. So, and that's where this sort of abstract idea comes to something investable, right? As soon as you can sort of show the traction, as soon as you can show that either people using it or you actually analyze it, you did at least something, right? So something that could show that this goes sort of beyond the idea. Maybe you just, I don't know, just talk to some people and said, yes, this is a great idea, this is something like this, but at least show some kind of attraction to see that your assumptions and your idea is somewhat tested and somewhat rooted into reality rather than purely in your head.
Yeah. So one thing I've done in the past, and that works with software, right? It doesn't work with hardware nearly as well, but and I also, people feel very differently about it. But I have spent some of my own money sometimes for ideas, because I knew, like, okay, if I need approval to buy this software or whatever, it's just not going to work. And so on occasions, if I was advocating, we need to do our marketing differently, and this is how we should do it, I have gone and spent my own money, whatever, $50 or something, to buy software, do a couple things with it, take screenshots or a quick video, and then share that with people. Because otherwise, you're opening yourself to the same thing. Like, well, I have this idea, I haven't really tried, I haven't really done anything. And then you get the pushback. I know a lot of people, for very legitimate reasons, say, there's no reason I should ever spend my own money for something for work. The company should pay for it. But for me, I've done it multiple times, and it's always been worthwhile, just in moving things forward and all of that. So, but I know you can't necessarily just buy a bottling company on the side to prove your point to your boss. But maybe something else. You could have a drone. You could buy a drone and do delivery from your kitchen to your living room just to prove a point. That wouldn't be too expensive.
Yeah. Okay.
Just to add here, but like, for example, one of my bosses told me, like, oh, Diana, you need to be able to work better with developers. And I'm like, okay, so I had to develop a couple of stuff. And he's like, no, but you still need to improve. I'm like, okay. And then I didn't have the opportunity in the company, and I joined a hackathon. I found out my own team. I worked with developers, and we won an award. And it was a great experience. And now, like, they even want to invest in our idea, which was more like a personal challenge.
Yeah, it's a great example. Like it.
All right. Well, Matthew, thank you so much. That was a really always a pleasure to see you. I probably see you very soon again. So Matthew, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.